Hey, we're back in John this week. We went through verses 1 through 5 in the first chapter of John last week, and so we're going to pick up in verse 6 and we're going to go to verse 13. So again, fairly small section, but there's a lot in especially this first chapter of John, so we'll probably move fairly slowly through the first chapter especially. So this one will be another fairly short section, but again, a lot in it. So let's go ahead and jump into it, and then we'll kind of break it down from there. So this is the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 6. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And so there's a lot of things that get referenced here, and a few things just to kind of address at the top before we even talk about all the specific things that are getting addressed here. One thing that you might recognize or realize right away is that what's not in the book of John is Jesus' birth story. So if you read Matthew or Luke, you'll have a pretty detailed description of the process of Mary and Joseph and no room in the inn and Jesus being born and the shepherds and the wise men and all of that stuff is in there. John skips over all of that. He doesn't address any of Jesus' childhood or any part of Jesus' life all the way up to the baptism by John. And so the John that's being referenced here in verse 6 is John, who I'm trying to get in the habit of calling John the Baptizer and not John the Baptist, just because John the Baptist sounds like a guy you happen to know whose name is John, who is part of the Baptist denomination in our day and age, but that's obviously not who John is. He's not part of a denomination. He is a baptizer. He is baptizing people in the name of God. So that's who John is that's being referred to here. Another kind of high-level thing that I think about with this section is if you could memorize these first 13 verses of John, I think you would have a pretty good just overall explanation of who Jesus is and what it means to be a follower of Jesus and what that role is within the context of the earth and time and all of creation. So John is giving us the whole synopsis of the Christian faith essentially in these first 13 verses. And he doesn't really take his foot off the gas at all through the whole book, but he sets up this framework of who Jesus is and what that should mean to us and what that does to us and how it can impact us right up front. So he doesn't take any time. He doesn't try to make a great story. He gets into stories and laying out details of the process of Jesus' life and ministry after this first section, but he comes right out of the gate with the epitome of what the Christian faith is all about. So I would really encourage you, if you don't have a great concept around that or an easy way to explain that, familiarize yourself with this section especially, because it'll be kind of the framework that you would need to have a conversation with anybody who was not sure about Jesus or what he was or what he meant to the world or to the Christian faith particularly. You could have pretty good answers to all of that just through these words alone. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about what we actually see in the text. So we see John is bearing witness, and that word witness is referenced twice, is used twice here. That's the English word witness. Obviously wasn't written in English, but the Greek root or the Greek word that uses is actually specific to like trial or a court case. So this is somebody who's bearing witness that John is very purposefully including that language to say, if this was a trial, if we were in court, we would have reasonable faith in this story because here is a witness who is telling us that this is the truth. And so you'll see that theme carried throughout the book. So again and again, as Jesus is interacting with different people, John will tell us that these are more people bearing witness, and here are more witnesses of what happened, and here are more witnesses of the miracles and of who Jesus is and of his position in the Trinity and all of those things. So that's a very specific term that's being used there. And so we see John continue to use this language about the light. So he talks about he was not the light, but he came to bear witness about the light, and then he describes what this light is, that as he has already referenced in the first section, which we talked about last week. So this is the true light, which gives light to everyone that was coming into the world. And so this next verse here in chapter 10, or in verse 10 says, "He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him," which is an interesting sentence because it actually kind of has two meanings. So it says that he was in the world, which he created, and the world didn't know him, and that's true from the beginning of time, right? So God is present and active in the world all the way back to Adam and Eve and the beginning of creation. And again, if we read through the Old Testament, we see people losing sight of him and not acknowledging that he's there. And so this is a broad statement about God being in the world and the light being in the world for people to know him and not acknowledging that or not seeing that. But at the same time, it's also referencing Jesus specifically. So Jesus is the light born of the flesh in the world, to demonstrate the perfect life to us. And in his life, in his experience to this point, people did not realize that's who he was. So he is literally God walking among man, and the men who interacted with him in that time frame were not aware that that's who he was until it becomes revealed later in the story. And so shortly after this, in the book, in this first chapter of John, we see even John the Baptizer didn't realize that it was Jesus until the Spirit revealed it to him. So there's this process of people coming to this realization who this Jesus guy is. And until then, he's just God among his people in the world, and yet they did not know him. So it's kind of an interesting double meaning in that phrase there. The next line, it says, well, I guess it's part of the previous line. So it says, "The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world." And then if you jump down in that was verse 9. If you jump down in verse 11, "He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him." And this is interesting too. And going into verse 12, it says, "But to all who did receive him," and then it goes on from there. And so at the beginning of this paragraph is this, it gives light, and then it says receive. So there's a two-sided deal here. There's a giving and a receiving. So it's not just the light that's just freely given to everyone. In chapter 12, or in verse 12 and 13, it explains exactly what it means, that there's a limit, or a kind of a something that has to take place on the part of the receiver for it to be fully received. So it's not a universal giving of the light to everyone. It is a universal opportunity for everyone to receive the light, but it is on the individual to actually receive it, as we go through 12 and 13. So 12 says, "But to all who did not receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become," to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. So that whole section is describing exactly what that means. That is this laying out that it's not through blood, meaning you're not born into it, and it's not of the will of the flesh or the will of man. So no human can make this happen, only God. So there's this description of what it means to receive. So we already know that it's given. That's mentioned in verse 9, that there's this giving of a light, and then there's this receiving of light that becomes the responsibility of individuals. And we see that there were people who did not receive it, right? He was rejected by his own people. So that little section there, and we kind of jumped over it in this verse 10, getting into this giving and receiving, we left out this middle piece where it says, "He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him." Sorry, we already did talk about that. Verse 11, it says, "He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him." So when it says he came to his own, this is the Jews specifically. So Jesus was Jew. He was part of the line of David. He was part of the tribe of Israel, and so this is who he is. This is his ethnicity. This is the group that he is coming initially to address, because this is God's people. This is Abraham's people. This is Isaac and Jacob, who becomes Israel. This is their people, and Jesus comes to them first because those were God's chosen people going back to the Old Testament, and there were a lot of people within that group who did not receive him, and so it paints a pretty clear picture about the kind of the dividing line between those who receive and those who do not, and the rest of the book will kind of explain how that happens, and we'll see stories and parables and things that lay out what these differences between the people who receive him and the people who do not, and his own people who reject him, and all of that play out. But again, going back to kind of what I said up top, is that this is a pretty clear, high-level synopsis of what the gospel is, and John wants that to be clear to us right out of the gate. So right up front, he's the light, he is the Word, he's there at the beginning, he's there who creates the world, and then we immediately get into he's here on earth with us, or he was here on earth with us. He interacted with this guy John, and then from there you'll see all these other interactions he has with a lot of other people. So that's the general overview of verses 6 through 13 of the first chapter of the Gospel of John. So come on Sunday, and we'll talk about that further, and here are a few questions for us to discuss at that time. So the first one is, does leaving out the birth of Jesus change the impact of the rest of the story, and why? If the light is given to everyone, do you receive it? And what responsibility comes with, how do you receive it, and what responsibility comes with it? And then kind of attached to that is this other piece of, do you bear witness about the light, and how? So that's what we saw John the Baptizer doing, is bearing witness. Do you think John, or why do you think John is using the light to describe Jesus in this section? Do you think Jesus being rejected by his own people affected him differently than being rejected by anyone else? Why do you think John calls it a right to be granted, or a right that is granted to become children of God? And finally, what's the difference between the blood, the will of the flesh, and the will of man, as it's talked about in verse 13? So come on Sunday, and let's see what everybody thinks. Thanks.